Okay, so now the big question is, how does this point to Christ? That's always the big question. How does this in the Old Testament point to Christ? Well, the first point is that the law that's given is not the ultimate thing in the Bible. It's not the ultimate thing, but Christ is. Christ is the ultimate thing. So, in Galatians 3, verse 24, this is in the New Testament, Paul writes, "So the law was put in charge to lead us to Christ, that we might be justified by faith." So saying there, the law was put in charge of the Israelites to lead them to Christ. And the Greek word there is pedagogus, which would be a Greek slave who is employed to look after the children, to take them to school, to discipline them, and to get them, basically take care of them as a guardian until they were ready to act as proper grown-ups or something like that. So the idea here is that the law is not the ultimate thing. Just like the Greek slave, the pedagogus that you employ is not the ultimate thing. There's something else better that you're working towards. And so the law was there to be put in charge of the Israelites, to show them the right way to live, that God wants them to live, but also to get them ready for Christ, because the law showed them that they could not keep it. So keep breaking the law. So it shows them they need something else, and they need, in the law, they have to keep making sacrifices, right? And so it's showing them the whole time, you need a sacrifice to pay for their sins. And it's pointing to the fact that one day Jesus Christ is going to come and make a sacrifice for his people. Now, as well, because in Galatians 3:24 it says that we might be justified by faith. There's something about the law that shows us that we're going to be justified by faith instead of being justified by the law. Which brings us on to the next point, which is that Jesus obeyed the law. Jesus obeyed the law. So this is one of the ways that the law pointed to Christ. No human has ever been able to obey the law fully. Everyone always breaks it at some stage. Now, what Jesus did was he never broke the law. He obeyed the law perfectly, which means that Jesus was totally righteous. Jesus, in God's sight, was not guilty and righteous. In other words, he was justified in God's sight. So, the law points to Christ, because when we look at the law, we see that we can't keep it. But then we see that Jesus could keep it. And because he could keep it and he's fully righteous, what we find later in the Bible is that anyone who puts their trust in Jesus, they get his righteousness credited to their account. It's as if he clothes them in his righteousness. Now it also points to Christ because of his sacrifice. So remember I said about the blood of the covenant, that when they ratify the covenant with God, they put half of the blood on the altar and they sprinkle half of the blood on the people. This is called the blood of the covenant. Now Jesus, before he goes to the cross to make his sacrifice, he refers to his own blood as the blood of the covenant. It's when he's taking communion with them, which then wasn't called communion, it was the Passover, which reminds us of the Exodus as well. In Matthew 26:28, he says, "For this is my blood, the blood of the covenant, that is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." So when we look at the law and we see how they made the sacrifice and there was the blood of the covenant, that points to the fact that Jesus is going to come one day and shed his blood. And that's going to be the blood of the covenant. It's going to be the blood of the new covenant that we'll come on to in future weeks. Now it also points to Christ because of this, and I find this very helpful. Notice how the Israelites were saved from slavery and then God gave them the law. They were saved and then they were given the law. It wasn't the case that they were given the law and then they were saved. Okay? Now same way with us, right? We're slave from slavery. Slavery to sin, slavery to slavery to Satan. We're saved from slavery to Satan and then brought into wonderful slavery to Jesus. But what happens is, then we obey Jesus. Then we see Jesus' law and we obey it. It's not the other way around. Now a lot of people got it twisted and they think that what you do is you obey all of God's laws, and when you've obeyed enough of God's laws, then you will be saved. But when we look at the Israelites, we see that's not the case. God saves you first, and then God says, this is my law. And then we follow it joyfully. So I find that quite interesting. So what we're going to do now is we're going to finish, right, just chatting about this question here, which is, how can we follow God's principles in the Ten Commandments whilst at the same time recognizing that Jesus is the one who has perfectly fulfilled the law? What could two possible wrong extremes be? So let's just chat about that question together amongst ourselves.